In this video, I'm going to show you a super easy way to sew a bias cut satin skirt. For this project, we're going to need pins, thread, measuring tape, elastic, maybe a zipper depending on your fabric, and then a non-stretch fabric. Your fabric should have some stretch when pulled on the bias. I'm going to drape the skirt on myself, making sure that I'm draping it on the bias. We're going to start by just draping the facing, so it only needs to be the length of however high you want your skirt down to the large hip. And you want to make sure that you're leaving some fabric at the top for seam allowance. And then we're going to do the same for the back of the skirt, again draping it on the diagonal, on the bias, and then cutting away just to the large hip. We're going to make adjustments later so you can be kind of rough at this stage when pinning your side seams. You also want to determine the height of your skirt at this phase so you can place pins to mark the height. The stretch from draping the skirt on the bias should have it fitting nice and snug. We're then going to measure the length that we'd like for our skirt, keeping in mind the seam allowance for the hem. Now, taking off our skirt, we're going to trim around where we placed our pins, marking out a 1 centimeter seam allowance along all the edges. It helps to fold this piece in half to make sure that both sides are equal. And as you can see here, there's quite a bit of stretch because of us draping it on the bias. We're then going to do the same for the back piece, making sure again to leave our 1 centimeter seam allowance. We now have the two facing pieces of our pattern. We're now ready to cut the other two pieces of our pattern. So laying out the facing piece again on the diagonal on the bias, we're going to cut that piece out, but we're going to cut it with the length that we'd like for our skirt. And we're going to continue the angle of the facing to create more of a bell shape for this skirt. And we're going to continue using the measuring tape to cut out the front piece of this skirt. And then we're going to do the exact same for the back piece. Again, creating the bell shape and cutting it on the diagonal of the fabric. We should now have 4 pieces to our pattern, the front and the back, and then the front and the back facing. We're then going to place right sides together of our front and back piece and pin the side seams. And then we're going to do the exact same, placing right sides together of our facing pieces and pinning the sides. You can also now trim your facing pieces to make sure they align. You're now going to sew with a straight stitch along all 4 of the sides that you just pinned. Depending on the stretch that draping on the bias is going to give you, you may be able to place your skirt on without putting in a zipper. The fabric I chose has quite a bit of stretch when draping it on the bias, so all I need to do is add an elastic. If your fabric doesn't have enough stretch that you can no longer put it on now that you've sewn your side seams, I'll show a way of putting in the zipper later in the video. If you're going to be using elastic, you want to measure out the length, keeping in mind at least a 2 centimeter overlap. But either way, if you're using an elastic or a zipper, we're going to start by attaching our main pieces to our facing. So placing right sides together, we're going to pin the facing pieces and the main piece of the skirt together. We're going to do that all along the waist, making sure that our side seams are aligned. And then we're going to sew along where we pinned. We're then going to do a top stitch to lock in that facing, which will also create a crisper edge. So you're going to pin along, making sure that you're also pinning the seam allowance on the side of the facing. Pinning down that seam allowance and sewing right along the edge of your seam. You may want to iron this first before you sew. And then you're going to sew where you pinned with a straight stitch. You want to sew nice and close to the seam. And here it is on the black skirt as well. You're then going to flip that piece over and give it a good iron. We're then going to move on to our hem. So we're just going to fold it over twice, pin it down, and then iron. And then with a straight stitch, sew along where we pinned. And again, here it is on the black skirt as well. For the elastic, we're just going to pin the overlap and then with a zigzag stitch, sew a little box to attach the 2 ends. And with the elastic now in a loop, we can attach it to the inside of our facing. Again, using our zigzag stitch, we can sew along right under where we placed our top stitch. And we want to be locking in that seam allowance. You want to slightly tug on the elastic as you're sewing so that it fits all along the waist of your skirt. I ended up doing 2 zigzag stitches to really lock in the elastic. Now, if your skirt didn't have enough stretch when cutting on the bias, your second option from the elastic is to add in your zipper. So you're going to place your close-ended invisible zipper in the seam of your skirt. And using your zipper foot, you're going to sew that zipper in. You're then going to use a seam ripper to unstitch the side seam where you just placed your zipper. You're then going to flip over your facing, placing its right side on the right side of your fabric and pin it down onto your zipper. The facing will help create a clean finish for your zipper. Then, still with your zipper foot, you're going to sew the facing onto the zipper. Depending on if your fabric frays, you can lock in all your raw edges with a zigzag stitch. When doing this stitch, you want to make sure that the needle is going over the edge of the fabric. And as you can see, this does a great job locking in your raw edges. The final step is to secure your facing to your skirt. So you do this by placing a pin right in the seam and then locking it in with a stitch. And you're all done! Thank you for watching, and if you liked the video, please subscribe.